Oh, welcome back to the workshop. Got different set dressing today because the usual 1/12 stuff is far too small. This old car is 1/8 scale. This car's from the 1970s. It's a Mardave Stockmaster, and originally it had much smaller wheels and sat very low to the ground. And it was a stock car. It raced with a Vico 19 engine. I bought it when I was 16. It was already 10 years old then and had retired from racing. It cost £80, which was then a huge amount. To put that into perspective, I was extremely proud of my amplifier, which I'd bought second hand, and that had cost £20. So this was a really big investment at the time. In the early 1990s, I replaced the Vico 19 with a bull-raced pull-start Thunder Tiger 15, which made it much faster, though in fact I'd actually replaced it for the convenience of the pull-start. I drove it around like that for a short while.
And though we see it here without the body fitted, it's clear that by now I'd realised that it needed to be driven on a loose surface. The car was hopelessly difficult to drive on a high grip surface, grip rolling whenever I so much as touched the steering at any speed. And the drive belt would come off quite often. I'd fitted buggy tyres at the rear and stadium truck tyres at the front, but the crude suspension prevented me from taking advantage of the performance the new motor offered.
And by that time my Midnight Pumpkin, which I'd bought in the early 90s, had died of old age, but the motor and gearbox and rear axle was still good. So I did this. It's an unbelievably crude job of bracket making and suspension design, but I did convert this thing successfully to electric years and years before Tesla. Using the Pumpkin's rear axle meant that I had to source some giant front wheels for it, which was actually not too bad an idea, as the front suspension setup is unbelievably short travel and really very crude. It's a sliding pillar arrangement. The car's just spent 8 or 10 years in storage in the attic. It gets moved every time I'm looking for something else, and damage has occurred. One of the motor wires has come unsoldered. This component had come unglued and had to be reattached only this morning with a rather crude styrene reinforcement bracket to stop it happening again. And although that's all the damage I've found so far, the car breaks another of my rules because it doesn't have a driver figure. I'd like to sort that out. The trouble is, this car is quite big. It's 1/8 scale, and I don't have a figure and haven't been able to find a figure of the right size, except this dude. He seems to be going for some sort of James May lookalike with the rugby shirt, but he's got the stripes going the wrong way, honestly. I've no idea who he's meant to be. I can report that he used to have dreadlocks, but they snapped off the back of his head in the attic, and I bought him years ago meaning to put him in this car. He's got his legs in very silly positions, presumably because he's been modelled in the middle of a I'm to be a Stockmaster driver celebratory dance move, So let's get the grinder out and get rid of his legs. I must admit he doesn't seem quite as happy about his fate right now, but I'm sure we can do something about that by moderating the angle at which he sits. The trouble I'm having is his arms. They're not at the right angle to his torso. I think they're going to have to come off and be repositioned. If we just reverse the car out and get over to the bench, we can see that I've cut him off at such an aggressive angle in terms of his torso that he now sits more or less reasonably straight. The problem really is his arms. I did have to whip one of them off to get the grinder in, but I don't think he minded. They make them tough, these rugby players. And yeah, I cut that arm off so I could twist it forwards, but as you can see, it's not really in a steering wheel holding grip. But I've noticed that this plastic becomes very, very soft and pliable when I've changed this angle and this angle. So now, when he puts his arms out in front of himself, he sort of could be holding a steering wheel. And he sits at that angle, with his head reasonably upright. Now he's got his arms glued on in the right position, I want to do something about his garish rugby shirt. So I think I'm going to give him a black t-shirt instead to match the car, and I can touch in here where his dreadlock snapped off in the attic. And here's our brave driver now that I've painted his t-shirt black. It's not dry yet, it's matte paint, so I'm hoping it'll dry looking like cloth rather than the leather it resembles at the moment. I've got a blodge on his neck which really annoyed me. I'm going to have to get that off. My 1/12 scale subjects are usually lucky to get a popsicle stick to hold them across the body, but this guy's actually getting a bridge made of 1mm styrene. It might be a bit bendy for him, so I'll be reinforcing it with a couple of strips of 2mm stuff underneath. So here's my 1mm thick driver support, stiffened with some scrap, and I've added some 4mm thick by 10mm wide chunks to give it plenty of surface area when I glue it to the inside of the body. The driver will sit on it like that. I epoxied him to the styrene board because I wasn't sure what plastic it was made of and how well it would respond to my solvent adhesive, and the steering wheel in his hands is simply a single phase taken from some 3-core household electrical cable, painted black and glued into position. While waiting for the paint I've put on the driver figure bracket to dry, I put a screen in the old Stockmaster body. It's something I always wanted to do when it had an IC engine, to help conceal the engine from my view. I always wanted that engine to be a driver figure even when this thing was IC. So it's been a long, long road, but hopefully it'll be a satisfying one. At last it's going to have a screen and a driver. I've put him in the car. Let's have a look at him. There he is. That's a lot more scale than the cylinder head of a little 2-stroke glow engine. Well, he looks ready, but before I drive this thing I need to do a couple more things. I've got to solder that errant motor wire back into position, and I'd really like to try and find out a better way of holding the body on than the cable ties I've been using so far. Once that lot's done, it'll be time to start thinking about where I want to put the battery. When I first converted this car to electric, I used to put a big fat NiCad in here, but they're quite physically tough and can take the knocks. I don't fancy slinging one of my soft-bodied lipos just underneath the car like that. I could buy a hard-bodied lipo, I guess, or I could have a lipo position up here within the body. I thought I'd go ahead and repeat the reinforcement that I did on the broken side, on the intact side, and because I haven't yet painted this black, it's easier for you to see what I've done. There's a sort of dip in this thing, which I've filled with lots of layers of styrene, and then once I got a flat surface relative to this thing, I just glued a bar across. There's an L-shaped bit of white styrene helping to reinforce the joint. I've got the wire resoldered back onto the motor, so now it's time to see if it all goes. Okay, I've got it hooked up to a lipo, and the wheels are off the ground.
This isn't my long-term battery solution. This battery is far too small for this car, but it will allow me to test drive it. And in fact we do have a problem. The steering isn't really self-centering very well. There, I've let go of the wheel and I'm going to have to give it a tweak to actually get it to straighten up. If I remove this plate, I'll be able to have a look at the servo and its linkage. So it looks as though the wheels are exerting a lot of drag on the ground. If I take the weight off the wheels, everything seems to work okay. I'm going to dismantle this servo saver. I dismantled the servo saver and found nothing wrong with it, so eventually I went ahead and changed the steering servo. This is a new Chinese thing, probably no better than the previous one, but newer. And it's no better. It still doesn't self-center. While I decide what I'm going to do about battery placement, there is one more job I can attend to straight away. This vehicle's rear tyres are the 1990s originals, and as you can see, they're not in the best of condition. So I've been able to find a pack of 2 at a reasonable price. I ordered a pair and was inexplicably sent a pack of 4. This is just to give you a clearer idea of the state of the tyre. It looks alright from the outside. These new ones, just like the old, do say all traction utility along here. So they seem to be the genuine part. They certainly fit perfectly and look exactly the same. While I've got the wheel off, I can show you how in the bad years before Amazon and eBay, whenever a part would break, I would simply make another one out of metal. In fact, this piece of aluminium was too thin for the job and has bent over the years, and in the process has slightly bent the shock absorber. Not that it matters. There. That looks much better with brand new rear tyres. I'm glad I did that. There's a popular YouTube show called the Slingshot Channel, whose owner, Jörg Sprav, makes tremendous use of tensile rubber in situations where a lot of people would use a steel spring. Inspired by Jörg's resourcefulness, I've come up with an idea for a simple double-way return spring using rubber to try and get my steering to self-center. Okay, one-handed driving, commence. This was a quick experiment to see whether a pair of opposing return springs would help the steering self-center. So I just wrapped a cable tie around the entire chassis to give me somewhere to connect the other end of the rubber bands to. Now that I know it works, I can probably come up with something simpler and more elegant, working on the same principles. For the past 8 or 10 years, this car's been equipped with this light-speed 35-turn 540 can motor. I took the car out to test it. I was driving it in some sand dunes and it suddenly stopped, and I found that the axle wouldn't spin forward or backwards, though I could spin one wheel forwards and let the other go backwards, so the diff was fine, and I assumed the motor had seized. I replaced it with a 27-turn motor from Goon RC. It was only £14, brushed. Then, oddly enough, I discovered that the light speed wasn't seized. It's absolutely fine, so I can only assume a bit of grit or something had got in there from the sand dunes I was driving on. It all seems fine now. As you might remember, I was a bit concerned about battery capacity, and I toyed with the idea of putting a battery here and then abandoned it on the grounds that the battery would be both ugly and vulnerable. Instead, I've rubber banded this into position. At 2,200 milliamp hours, it's just about big enough to run this thing for 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, we've got a more powerful motor and a bigger battery. Let's go back to the testing grounds.